Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This is a fully independent podcast. Now more than ever, independent media needs the support of listeners and viewers. Go to aroundtheempire.com to find out how to support the podcast, gain access to bonus content. Our guest today is Peter Kuznick. We talk about the checkered history relations between the United States and Russia and the USSR. We talk about his book, The Untold History of the United States, including a second edition with some new chapters on more recent history. In a bonus question, we talk about possible Russian revanchism, whether the Baltic states and other former USSR states in the region are now in danger if Russia begins to feel threatened by NATO activity in those states, and in the context of the current invasion of Ukraine. Professor Peter Kuznick is an author and historian, the professor of history, and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He was active in the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movements, and he remains active in anti-war and nuclear abolition efforts. He regularly provides commentary for all major U.S. and international media, and he's begun his fourth term as Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer. Welcome to Around the Empire. Professor Peter Kuznick is here with us today. I'm really excited to be talking to him. I'm a great fan of his work, and that work has been very useful to me, often, but particularly right now. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and it's really great to meet you.
Glad to meet you, Joanne.
So I had started telling you that I've been following the situation in Ukraine since the Maidan, following pretty closely and learning a lot about that whole situation, that country, that relationship. And through that whole period of time, I found myself much more sympathetic to the Russian point of view than the new people in power in Ukraine. But when this invasion happened, I saw the provocations happening. I understand all the issues with expansion of NATO and broken deals and broken promises. But I was still very shocked at a lot of things about this invasion. First of all, the fact that the Russians refused to call it an invasion, refused to call it a war, and still refuse, seemed very out of character. Up until now, I found their foreign ministry with Lavrov, their military, to be very matter of fact, fairly factual from the best I could, cross-check things. And Putin seemed to be a pretty reasonable person. And that seems to have all gone out the window from my perspective when this happened. And so I think I do understand their point of view, at least maybe better than most Americans, since I have spent a lot of time looking into it. I followed Dr. Stephen Cohen's work for a long time. But I do not understand, and I'm really, really worried. And so I've been sort of racking my brain, where did all this come from, the history of the relationship between the US and Russia, the West and Russia, Britain and Russia, NATO and Russia, this kind of thing. And I found myself going back to the work that you did with Oliver Stone, The Untold History. And I actually reviewed some of those chapters.
Did you get the new book? Did you just watch the video, or did you read the book?
I watched the video. I have a book, but is it the new book? I don't know. When did the new book come out?
The original book came out in 2012.
Yeah, I think that's the one I have.
2012. But we put out a new edition in 2019, which covers the period between 2012 and the beginning of 2019.
I don't have that.
That's got a lot of information about what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening globally, the geopolitical situation, how it changed during the second Obama administration, during the Trump presidency. So it puts us in a much more comprehensible framework that I would strongly recommend you getting.
I will.
We added a 160-page chapter, and that's being published in other parts of the world as a standalone book. But so now our big book is more than 900 pages, and gives the whole history of the American Empire, really, at least since the late 19th century.
Right. I actually wish that you've gone back a little further between, well, a friend and I were talking about this, and some of the patrons of the show, we discuss things in our Discord channel. And we read an article was brought up where it was Jacques Baud, I think, and he was saying that the US has always a goal, or a critical goal has always been to prevent Russia and Germany from becoming allies and collaborating. And I mean, it reminded me of some things I didn't really know, which was the relationship between the United States and Imperial Russia, like during the Civil War and things like that. Like it seemed like there was a decent relationship anyway, which went down the tubes with with the Bolshevik Revolution, the formation of the USSR, and then the World Wars. And there was a little bit of hope during World War II with the cooperation, but then one of the most tragic things that I learned from your work was the opportunity that was squandered after the FDR years, with Truman. It's such a pivot point in history. And I often think about how things might have been if that didn't happen, if Wallace had maintained and others had maintained more influence. So I just...
What is today's date? I've lost track.
The 9th.
Today is the 9th. So that means in 3 days, it's going to be the anniversary of Roosevelt's death and the day that Truman became president. So April 12th. It's a sad day in history.
Yes.
Because the world would have been different had Roosevelt lived 3 months longer, or had Wallace become president instead of Truman. The whole world would look different now. There would have been, Albert and I argue that there would have been no atomic bombings in World War II, and almost certainly no Cold War. And think of how different how better the world could have been if we had avoided the nuclear age and the Cold War. Now, people make the argument, well, the nuclear genie was already out of the bottle. We already had that knowledge. But if we had developed the bomb and said we weren't going to use it because we knew how horrific it was, and Truman knew how horrific it was. When Truman it was an amazing story that Truman was relatively a non-entity when he got chosen by the party bosses. They didn't choose him. They wanted to get rid of Wallace because they thought Wallace was too radical, and they wanted somebody who didn't have a lot of enemies. And they chose Truman as a default candidate, not because anybody thought he was qualified. He wasn't qualified. When he got elected in 1934, he was part of the Pendergast machine. And he was about to tell Pendergast that he was leaving the machine to go back and work on the farm. And Pendergast and Ailes met with him in Sedalia, Missouri, and they say, well, you can't. We need you to run for the Senate. And Truman says, I wanted to run for Congress, but you passed over me. Why'd you choose me for the Senate? I'm not prepared for that. They say, well, don't worry. We'll get you elected, and we'll get you advisors who'll tell you what to do. And they did. He didn't know that they had already offered this to 4 other people who turned it down before they offered it to Truman. So Truman gets elected, and his first term in office, he's shunned by the other senators. They call him the senator from Pendergast. They know he's a spokesperson for a corrupt political machine there. And then in 1940, when he's up for re-election, Roosevelt wasn't supporting him. He was coming in 3rd in the primary, and and Pendergast couldn't help him because Pendergast was in federal prison in Kansas City. And so he turned then to the Hannigan-Dickman machine. They ran St. Louis, and they threw their weight behind him, and he barely eked out the victory and got reelected in 1940. And then he runs this investigation into defense spending, and it's not doesn't really find very much, but he is beginning of a national reputation. So when the party bosses decided they wanted to get rid of Wallace because of his politics, they agreed on Truman. But the problem was that Wallace, who was a progressive visionary, was the second most popular man in America. And when on the day the Democratic Party convention started, July 20th, 1944, Gallup released a poll of potential voters asking them who they wanted on the ticket as vice president. 2% said they wanted Harry Truman. 65% said they wanted Henry Wallace. And the last time I did my math at Rutgers, 65 was a little bit more than 2. And we believed we were living in a democracy. Well, obviously, the Democratic Party was not a democratic institution at the time. But Wallace made a seconding speech for Roosevelt the first night. And even though the convention was already stacked by the bosses to go for Truman, the place broke out into a spontaneous demonstration led by people like Adlai Stevenson and Hubert Humphrey, among others. And this went on for an hour, Wallace demonstration. And in the middle of that, Senator Claude Pepper from Florida realized that if he could get to the microphone and get Wallace's name and nomination that night, then Wallace would sweep the convention. So he starts fighting his way through the crowd to the front. The party bosses see what's happening, to start screaming to Sam Jackson, who's chairing it, this is a fire hazard, adjourn immediately. And Jackson said, I would vote to adjourn. All in favor say aye, maybe 5% say aye, all opposed nay. Everybody says nay, says the motion carried, meeting adjourned. Pepper was literally 5 feet from the microphone when that happened. Had Pepper gotten 5 more feet, history would have been different. There would have been no atomic bombings, no Cold War. Wallace would have been president instead of Truman. The US and the Soviets would have continued to get along, would have maintained that post-war friendship. The United Nations would have meant something. And we, so much of the horrors that we've experienced in the last 77 years could have been averted.
Yeah. Just for a short bit, going back to the relationship with Imperial Russia, I'm not sure how relevant it is to today, but how did that go so far south so relatively quickly? How do we go from being?
Well, because Russia was our ally in World War I. The Russians were ill-equipped, and as the war wore on, they didn't have the right clothing, they didn't have the right equipment, and so when the Menshevik Revolution occurred first in 1917, the Mensheviks decided to keep Russia in the war, and that's part of what Lenin and Trotsky campaigned on, and their appeal for bread, land, and peace. Peace meant that they were going to pull Russia out of the war. But the West was furious with Russia when Russia pulled out of the war. And the Brest-Litovsk Treaty that Russia signed made tremendous concessions to Germany. And so from the very beginning, the US and the Brits and Japan and others tried to intervene in the Russian Revolution to stop the Bolsheviks. We had about 15,000 American troops, but there were more troops from Britain and Japan and other countries inside of Russia in 1917 to 1920. And so it betrayed all of Wilson's principles that the 14 points was founded on, showed the hypocrisy. Wilson hated revolution, and he hated the Russian Revolution more than any other. But there was support in the United States for the Russian Revolution. There was a faction of independents, progressives, who thought that the Russians should be allowed to create the kind of system that they wanted. But that was not the US position. And so the US sends the troops over there and intervene there. And from that point on, US Soviet relations were very, very bad. We refused to recognize them. The U.S. doesn't even recognize the Russian government until 1933, after Roosevelt's in office. So, and then we do develop the friendship, as you were talking about, during World War II. It was an alliance of convenience, but so was the alliance with Britain. The Americans hated the British Empire as much as they hated a lot of what was going on inside the Soviet Union during this time. And it was really a three-way civil war that was being fought, or three-way war between the US, the Soviets, and the Brits, which Americans don't understand the extent to which that political leaders, including Roosevelt, deeply hated British imperialism. And Roosevelt spoke out against British imperialism and French imperialism. And the leading critic of the British and French colonialism was Henry Wallace. Truman initially sounded like he might go along with supporting the removal of French troops from Indochina, but he reneged on that. And then by 1950, the United States is really funding France's war in Vietnam.
Yeah. Also, I wonder if you could touch on the relationship between Britain and, well, the barely relationship, the rivalry, the animosity between Britain and Russia, because that still seems to be a thing today that derails.
Today, Boris Johnson and the Brits are as bloodthirsty as anybody when it comes to what's happening in Ukraine. This goes way back. Churchill said that we have to strangle Bolshevism in the cradle. And the Brits wanted the US to militarily intervene with them to overthrow the Bolshevik government. Wilson refused to go that far, fortunately, but the Brits were ready to do so. And they had a deep hatred of Bolshevism, much, much greater than the American hatred. That's why during the war, Churchill made his accommodation and in fact got along pretty well with Stalin. And it was Stalin and Churchill who wrote on the back of that envelope, dividing up Europe. You know, Soviets will get 85% influence here and the Brits will get Greece. And, you know, they divided it up. And Churchill said, we should destroy this. It's a nasty document. And Stalin says, no, let's keep it for posterity. Now we have that back of that envelope in which the piece of paper in which they actually divided Europe up. But the Brits were willing to make certain concessions. What the Brits didn't do is open up the second front. You have to remember that in early 1942, so throughout most of World War II, one of the big myths of World War II is that the United States won the war in Europe. Americans still believe that. The reality, of course, is that throughout most of the war, the US and the Brits were fighting 10 German divisions between us, while the Soviets were fighting more than 200 German divisions. So the big demand that Stalin made was to open up the second front in Western Europe, so the Germans would have to fight a two-front battle and would take the pressure off the Soviets. And Roosevelt understood that and understood why Stalin was correct. And so he sends a letter, a message to Stalin saying, please send Foreign Minister Molotov and one of your trusted generals to Washington, because we need to discuss these very important strategic issues. And they came here, I think it was late May of 42, and met with Marshall and Roosevelt. And at that meeting, they issue a statement that we're going to open up the second front before the end of 1942. And the US was committed to that. And the American military leaders demanded that. However, Churchill undermined it. And he said, we don't have the troops, we don't have the shipping in order to pull this off. And it doesn't really open till June 6, 1944, with the invasion at Normandy on D-Day. But the American military leaders were furious. Marshall condemned what he called periphery pecking and said that we should change our whole strategy, let the Brits rot, let's go and fight the war against Japan first, rather than the other way around. Eisenhower, who led the campaign in North Africa in early 43, said that when we go into North Africa, this is going to be the blackest day in US history. They knew what they wanted to do was fight the Germans, but the United States didn't do that. And again, the Brits are responsible. And on top of that, then as the Cold War is beginning, it was Churchill who came here and made the Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri in 46. And that was really, the Americans were, again, appalled by that. Eleanor Roosevelt, Henry Wallace, I mean, lots of the Roosevelt family overall said, what are you doing dividing the world in this way into this black and white, good guys and bad guys, slave and free? You know, this is the British plan. It's not the American intention, but that kind of rhetoric and that kind of thinking, which finally, you know, Truman would go back and forth. Whoever was the last person he talked to, he'd agree with. He was kind of a non-entity in a lot of ways, but wanted to be a tough guy and didn't really understand the situation well. But the point I wanted to make before was that Truman was vice president for 82 days before Roosevelt died. During that time, Roosevelt spoke to him twice, but nothing of substance.
Shocking.
And when Truman becomes president on April 12th, he does not even know the United States is building an atomic bomb. Nobody had enough respect for Truman to even tell him we were building an atomic bomb. He doesn't find out till after he's sworn in, when Secretary of War Stimson takes him aside and says, well, we're building this terrible weapon. And Truman says, well, I didn't ask him anything about it because I had a lot on my mind. And the next day, Jimmy Burns flies up from South Carolina in Forrestal's private plane, and he gives him a bigger briefing. And Truman writes in his memoirs, Burns told me not just a bigger weapon, a weapon great enough to destroy the whole world. Truman knew he was beginning a process that could end life on the planet. And when he gets a full briefing at Potsdam on July 25th, he writes in his journal, we've discovered the most terrible, this is a briefing about the bomb test in Alamogordo, which was so powerful, 18,000 kilotons, or 18 kilotons, 18,000. And he writes in his journal, we discovered the most terrible weapon in history. This may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah and his fabulous ark. Not a bigger, more powerful bomb, but fire destruction. He said the same thing basically on April 25th when he got briefed by Stimson and Groves. And so Truman knew what he was doing. He knew the bombs weren't necessary. He knew the Japanese were defeated. And when he goes to Potsdam, he has lunch with Stalin on July 17th. And he says, and he writes in his journal that night, says, Stalin will be in the Jap war by August 15th. Finny Japs when that occurs. He writes home to his wife, Bess, the next day, the Russians are coming in. We'll end the war a year sooner now. Think of all the kids who won't be killed. Truman and the leaders of the United States knew there were two ways to end the war without using the atomic bomb. The first was to change the surrender terms, tell the Japanese they could keep the emperor, because that was the main stumbling block. The second was to wait for the Soviet invasion. The United States, from the day after Pearl Harbor, was trying to get the Soviets to intervene on our behalf in the Pacific War. But they were fighting against the Germans. They couldn't. So finally at Yalta in February 45, Stalin gives in to Roosevelt's appeal and says that the Soviets are going to come into the Pacific War 3 months after the end of the war in Europe, which would put the date around August 8th or August 9th. And the US intelligence kept saying that Soviet entry will convince all Japanese further fighting is futile. Over and over again, US intelligence said that. And Truman knew that. Truman refers to the intercepted telegram from the Japanese foreign minister to the Japanese ambassador in Moscow on July 18th as the telegram from the Jap emperor asking for peace. We knew that the Japanese wanted to surrender. They were just looking for a way to save face. And Truman then goes ahead and uses the bomb. And the country that understood the best that the bomb was totally unnecessary was the Soviet Union, because the Japanese had adopted an unfortunate strategy to try to intervene, get the Soviets to intervene on their behalf to get better surrender terms. And so when former Prime Minister Hirota meets with the Japanese ambassador Malik in Tokyo, June 2nd, June 3rd, Malik writes back to the Kremlin that the Japanese are desperate to surrender. So the Soviets knew better than anybody that there was no military justification for the atomic bombs. And the Soviets interpreted it exactly like the scientists had warned. The American scientists warned the Soviets would interpret it as if they were the target of the bomb, that the bomb was dropped to tell them what would happen, and worse, if they interfered with US plans in Europe or in Asia. And that was the message that Stalin and his generals, Zhukov and the others, all drew, that they were the target of the bomb. So the Cold War, which was so unnecessary, is beginning even before World War II ends. And Wallace is the one who understood that best.
Did Truman fully understand that, do you think? I know that he understood a lot of it from what you just said, but were there pieces that he was missing, pieces of that puzzle that he was missing when he made that decision or went along with it?
Well, General Groves said Truman was like a little boy on a toboggan. So we just dragged him along for the ride. He says he never said yes, he never said no. He would have had to intervene to stop them. He signed off on it. It wasn't so much that there was a real decision. There's a debate about how much we want to think of it as a decision, but it was in motion. But the thing that's interesting is that the United States had 8 5-star admirals and generals in 1945. 7 of the 8 are on record saying the atomic bombs were either militarily unnecessary, morally reprehensible, or both. Admiral William Leahy, who chaired the Joint Chiefs of Staff meetings and was Truman's personal chief of staff, said that the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki had no material effect on the end of the war. He said, using these weapons put us on the level of the barbarians of the Dark Ages. He was interviewed by Jonathan Daniels, a Truman biographer, in 1949. And he said, well, they said we'd use it only on military targets. Then they went ahead and killed as many women and children as they could, which was what they wanted all along. General MacArthur, who wanted to use atomic bombs in Korea, said that had we told the Japanese they could keep the emperor, they would have surrendered 3 months earlier in May without the use of the bomb, which MacArthur was always opposed to. About World War II. Eisenhower gets briefed by Stimson at Potsdam and that we're about to use the bomb. And Eisenhower said, I was getting more and more depressed just thinking about it and listening to him. Then he asked me what I thought. I told him my war in Europe is over. Said, but so I didn't offer anything, but he told him I'm against it on 2 counts. First, the Japanese are defeated and ready to surrender. It's not necessary to use that. And second, I hated to see my country be the first to use such a weapon. Eisenhower repeated that numerous times, but they all knew it wasn't necessary. In fact, General Groves, head of the Manhattan Project, issues a warning to all the generals in the field, the officers in the field, not to issue any public statements about the atomic bombings. And when he was later asked about it, he said, I didn't want MacArthur and the others to say the war could be won without the atomic bombs. So they knew this, they all knew this. And, the fact that American people don't know this, what ends the war is not the atomic bombs, it's the Soviet invasion. And when the Japanese Prime Minister Suzuki was asked on August 13th, the day before the war ends, why they have to surrender so quickly, he says, because the Russians are already in Karafuto, tomorrow and Manchuria. Tomorrow they're going to take Hokkaido. The foundation of Japan will be destroyed. We have to surrender when we can still surrender to the Americans. That's what ended the war. When Obama, I take students every year to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Tokyo or Kyoto. And I've been doing that since 95, the 50th anniversary, and until the pandemic, but we're going to start up again next year. And where was I going with that about I'm not sure, but the atomic bombs were absolutely unnecessary. And it starts this insane arms race. The Soviets don't test their bomb until August of 49. Then the United States tests their hydrogen bomb in 52. And then the Soviets, where we're 4 years behind on the atomic bomb, were only 8 or 10 months behind on the hydrogen bomb. The bomb they tested in 53 is not a full hydrogen bomb, but the Americans believed it was, and it was very close. And so from there, that's the insanity. one thing that I always found myself doing at the atomic bomb regime in Hiroshima was writing down the same statistic that one of the exhibits said by 1985, the world had accumulated the equivalent of 1.47 million Hiroshima bombs. How insane are we as a species? Why do we need 1.47 million Hiroshima bombs? How many times do we have to be able to kill everybody on the planet before we're satisfied? But that's the kind of madness that is still prevailing in the world. And the situation in Ukraine that you started with, one of the main reasons we have to end it as quickly as possible is because we don't want it to spill over. We don't want it to start World War III. Putin is making nuclear threats. Putin has put his nuclear forces on high alert. Everybody's terrified about the prospect of this turning into a nuclear war.
Yeah.
I was on Chinese TV yesterday morning. I do a lot of Chinese TV. And the topic was the future of nuclear arms control. There was an expert from Moscow, an expert from Beijing, and me. And, none of us were optimistic. There's the level of trust and the possibility. In the United States, right now, one of the first things that Biden did was he extended the New START Treaty. The only arms control architecture that's left, really, is between the US and Russia, is the New START Treaty. And that would have expired on February 5th of 2021 had Biden not extended it, which he did, to his credit, after Trump refused to. And that's good for 5 more years. But we can't get a new treaty because you need a 2/3 vote from the Senate. No Republicans, or maybe 2 or 3, are going to support it. But if the Democrats even control the Senate after 2022, it'll be a surprise. So the future of arms control looks very, very bleak. And the chances, and the other lesson everybody's drawing from this, is that Ukraine should have kept its nuclear weapons in 1994.
Yeah.
Ukraine had the 3rd biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, 1,900 strategic bombs and 2,500 tactical nuclear weapons.
But didn't really have control over them, though, right?
Well, it had control over them. It didn't have all the
They
expertise.
physically had them, but yeah.
Physically had them, and could have, brought over some of those. Russia. Remember, after the Cold War ended, one of the things people were talking about was what's going to happen with all these Soviet nuclear scientists. Where are they going to go? And a lot of them, I'm sure, would have been happy to go to Ukraine and help them work their project. It's not just the Werner von Brauns who could be whores in that way. I'm sure a lot of the Russians were looking for ways to get fed also.
I didn't want to derail your point there, though. You were saying that the lesson that is coming out of this for some people is that they should have never given up those.
And when the US invaded Iraq in 2003, North Korea's official newspaper wrote, the only mistake that Saddam Hussein made was to not have weapons of mass destruction. If he had them, the US couldn't have invaded. And then what did Gaddafi do in Libya? He gave up his weapons of mass destruction. What does NATO do? Invades and overthrows him and rams a rifle up his butt and, bayonet. And, but that's the lesson that much of the world is drawing now. And I hate it. Mohammed al-Baradei said that, head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, said that 40 countries have the technological capability of developing nuclear weapons. And that was a few years ago. It might be more than 40 now. And logically, why would they stop? I mean, the same logic I understand why Ukraine wanted to join NATO. I understand why the Baltic countries, why the Eastern Europeans wanted to join NATO. They want that US nuclear umbrella. I think it's insanity. But I can understand from a nationalistic point of view in this dangerous world we're in, why people look at it that way. My goal, of course, is to eliminate nuclear weapons, to end all of these military alliances, which is what Kennedy and Khrushchev wanted to do after the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, exactly. I've got some questions from listeners of this show, if you're willing to entertain some of those. Going back to the FDR administration and then the Red Scare that came after that, was there any legitimate fear there? Like, were there any communists in the FDR sort of administration? Or was that all just
There weren't enough. We would be better off if there were more.
okay?
But were there some? Yes. Were they a security threat to the United States? No. I mean, was there espionage? We're talking about McCarthyism. The first group that they target, the House Un-American Activities Committee, Rankin and the others, the first group they target is the atomic scientists. And they said that E.U. Condon and the other atomic scientists were the weak link in America's national security. But the first set of hearings they have was not on the atomic scientists, it was on Hollywood. The big threat.
Yeah.
They understood that controlling the media and the messaging was their real goal. And that by the time they get to the atomic scientists, I mean, there was espionage, and people talk about Klaus Fuchs, and then the Rosenbergs gave them nothing that was in any way helpful. And David Rosenberg was an idiot, and he failed all 5 classes he took at City College and was not going to give the Russians anything useful. And Julius and Ethel did some, or Julius at least did some low-level espionage, but gave them nothing. But there was Ted Hall, and Ted Hall was a young genius from Harvard who did go out there and work on the implosion technique, the plutonium bomb, and gave them a lot of very good material and was either in or around the Communist Party. And Oppenheimer was, I think, in the Communist Party. My friends Marty Sherwin and Kai Bird think he wasn't in the Communist Party, and they wrote that brilliant biography, American Prometheus, won the Pulitzer Prize. So I think he probably was. So others think he wasn't, but it doesn't make any difference. He was ideologically, philosophically in support of the Communist Party. And Oppenheimer was the scientific head of the Manhattan Project. He said, I was a member of every left-wing front group on the left coast. He said, he gave 10% of his salary to the Communist Party every month to support the rebel forces in the Spanish Civil War, the Republican forces. So, there was a lot of communist influence in the United States during the Popular Front period, and some of those people were in the government. There's nothing wrong with that. There should be more of them. But when the Republicans, starting as early as 46, said that the choice in the 46 election is between communism and republicanism, that it was they argued that the Democrats had been taken over by the communists and that the New Deal was a communist policy, which is, of course, absurd. But then in 47, Truman bites the bait, takes the bait. And Truman starts the loyalty security hearings, and people would have to swear their fealty and pass loyalty oaths and sign loyalty oaths and have those big gatherings where they get together and sing God Bless America and denounce communism. It was Truman who implemented that. And Clark Clifford, his domestic advisor, says Truman knew it was bullshit. He said there was no communist threat, but he legitimized it. The same way that Carter legitimizes what Reagan is going to do. And when Reagan takes it over to the extreme right wing, but Carter starts it with the new Cold War rhetoric, the military spending, the operations in Central America, Afghanistan. That was under Carter, and then Reagan takes it further. Truman legitimized a lot of it, and then McCarthy and the others step in. McCarthy doesn't get on the scene until February 9th, 1950, when McCarthy makes his speech in West Virginia. I've got the names of 205 communists in the State Department, 57, it keeps changing the number. So, but they didn't pose a threat to America. They weren't spies. If they gave a little bit of intelligence, there was nothing that was very, very useful. Except for, Ted Hall did give some scientific information that probably sped up the Soviet bomb.
Yeah. By the time I was old enough to have any idea what was going on with politics, my parents I come from like three generations of Democrats, yellow dog Democrats, pro-labor union Democrats, but also very anti-communist, you know. So there was a stereotype, I think, pretty common among the Democrats that were like my parents.
But there were also, you have to remember that the communists were the backbone of the CIO. The communists really were the ones who built the auto workers and the steel workers and the rubber workers. All the big industrial unions have been organized, at least with the help of members of the Communist Party, who were the real organizers. And there was a lot of communist influence in the labor movement till the purges under, this kind of anti-communist hysteria when they do purge them. And then what the effect is going to be, the purging of the communists not only created a generation that was silent in the 1950s, but also the leaders of the civil rights movement, the leaders of the labor movement, a lot of leading intellectuals. This had a terrible effect on American life. Part of the vitality of the 60s was the reaction to the mindlessness, the brain dead 1950s. That was a result of this kind of purge of the left from American life.
Here's another question. It's a little bit of a long one, but I know that this subject is important to this person. He says, is the convention to have Ivy League educated Wall Street financiers serve in the executive branch positions by design? And what impact, influence did the quote unquote wise men, Harriman, Kennan, Lovett, McCloy, etc., have on our attitude toward the Soviet Union and Russia? And this is a multi-part. Even these figures didn't have a consistent view of Russia over time, we think. And Kennan reversed his outlook. And then there's a part two to this. I don't know if you want me to continue with it or.
No, let me try that part first. There's a lot there. And Oliver and I talk about that in Untold History, both the documentaries. Kennan writes a very interesting secret memo in 1948. And Kennan was the architect of US containment policy in the Cold War. And in Kennan's memo, he says, we've got 6.3% of the world's population, but we control 50% of the world's wealth. The challenge for the United States in the period ahead is to maintain that position of disparity. He says we can't do it with idealistic slogans talking about freedom and human rights. We have to do it by dealing with straight power concepts. That was their view. They wanted American hegemony. They flooded the administration. Harriman is a very interesting case. Harriman says, and he was the ambassador to the Soviet Union during the war, and he says that when he compared Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, he says Stalin was the most impressive of the three. He had the best grasp, the best mind, he was the most knowledgeable. Personally, he could be charming. He says they can't understand how that same person could be a mass murderer, but he was. And Harriman, when on April 22nd, 23rd, when Molotov came to the United States again on the way to the United Nations founding meetings in San Francisco, he comes to meet with Truman. Harriman rushes back from Moscow, breaks the world speed record in getting back to Washington, has a series of meetings with Truman and the other top advisors, and says that there's a barbarian invasion of Europe going on at Soviet hands right now. We've got to be tough. And so then at that meeting with Truman, and I think it was Molotov, must have been Molotov, Truman starts berating him for breaking all of Russia's deals. And Molotov says, I've never been talked to that way in my life. And Truman says, carry out your agreements. You don't have to be talked to like that. Then Truman goes out and he meets with people after, says, I gave it to him 1-2 to the jaw. And he said, we might not get 100% of what we want, but we should get 85%. And he meets with Joseph Davies. And Joseph Davies was the former ambassador to the Soviet Union. And he was one of these Wall Street guys also. And the liberals were very upset when he got appointed ambassador. They thought he'd be totally anti-Soviet, but he wasn't. He sympathized with the Soviet position. And he tells Truman, you're blowing it, that the Soviets have been good allies. They've done more than they promised throughout the war. And they've carried out their agreements. And it was Truman who misinterpreted it based on, well, he didn't know very much yet, and Stalin lectures him and informs him. But right from the beginning, so it was the Harrimans and these other people. Forrestal was the nightmare. I mean, Forrestal really is the one who, in 45, 46, and then later becomes Secretary of Defense before he has his nervous breakdown, commits suicide. I mean, Forrestal was he and Kennan, they wanted to set up this guerrilla warfare corps out, and you saw what they were doing in parts of Eastern Europe. So, these are very, very dangerous people, and they're not totally consistent, it's true. And Kennan in later life becomes a critic of Kennan in earlier life. I mean, to hear George Kennan later in his life, I know people in the family, and we've read the memoirs and all the people who are working on it. And the later Kennan is a man of great wisdom who understood the folly of NATO expansion and condemned it, said it was the biggest blunder the United States had ever made to expand NATO after the Soviet collapse. He was also passionately against the nuclear arms race. The late Kennan would be 10 degrees to the left of Joseph Biden, or maybe 25 on all of these issues. So some of them grow, they're not a monolith, but they're overall in the immediate post-war period, they exerted a very negative influence.
Yeah, boy, there's so many questions that I want to talk to you about. When you bring up Forrestal, I think of the Nightingale Program, and that's super relevant, important today.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how long it would take us to talk about that, or whether we should plan a part 2, but I thought I'd bring it up because I was hoping to get into some of, like, I'm going to go order your new book today and read that. Then I'll probably beg you to come back on and talk about that.
Sure,
but
we could do that.
But let's mention the Nightingale Program, just to if there are people who haven't heard about it and understand that those are the roots of the fighters that we're backing right now in Ukraine, if I understand it properly.
Yeah, it was a post-war operation. The CIA gets formed in 1947. And what the US was doing, we had worked with Bandera and some of the pro-fascist right-wing elements in Ukraine during the war. And Ukraine was always a divided country in lots of ways. There were a lot of people who were pro-Soviet, and there were a strong contingent of fascists. And a lot of Jews were killed in Ukraine by the fascists. I did an interview a couple of days ago, actually it was Portugal's leading newspaper, about Odessa and about what's the prospects now for Odessa and some of the history of Odessa. And it's interesting that in Odessa in 41, it was the Romanians who went in there, backed by the Nazis, the Wehrmacht, and they massacred Odessa had a population of 600,000 overall, about 200,000 of whom were Jewish. And they managed to get little more than 100,000 out before the invasion occurred. But over the next 2 years, almost all that other 100,000 are going to be killed. And in Kyiv, there were even more Jews killed. So there was and the Ukrainians were, the Ukrainian fascists were very, very involved in all of this. And so the United States left behind a contingent who we were training and working with in Ukraine. And part of this Operation Nightingale was to drop some of them who'd come over back into Ukraine in order to subvert the Russians, the Soviets' control of Ukraine from inside. They all would get, it was militarily about as successful as the Soviet invasion of Russian invasion of Ukraine is today. They were even less so. They were getting picked off. The Russians knew they were coming, and they were killing the ones who were dropped behind the lines. The interesting thing, though, is that when Forrestal was at the Bethesda Naval Hospital, he was reading from the poem, was it Ode to a Nightingale or something? When he got to the part about Nightingale, apparently underlined it in his copy, and then he jumped out the window. So it was this Project Nightingale that triggered something in his mind at the time. And it was just one of those crazy Cold War military sabotage operations that this was one of the ones that was futile.
So I mean, it didn't persist and or let's say reemerge recently. Like, what has it been?
I don't think we can draw a straight line
Okay.
from that to what's going on now. I think there's other things. We can put it in a different context next time we talk.
Okay. All right. I have one last thing, a bonus question. In this case, I would just like your opinion. In a recent interview, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, did an interview with Sky News, and the most of the things that made the headlines about it are not the things that interested me, because he talked about maintaining a balance. It was almost like saying there would be a tit for tat kind of thing going on, and not just in diplomacy. So in the past, we've heard a lot of things from NATO, from the neoconservative faction, saying like that the Baltic states are at risk, that other states in the region are at risk because the Putin, that not just Putin, but the Russians basically want to recreate their the Soviet states, the USSR. I never paid any attention to that. I thought it was kind of ridiculous. But I mean, after watching this Sky News thing and after this invasion of Ukraine, maybe the Baltic states do have a legitimate concern. If Russia continues to feel threatened, maybe they would, because geographically it would make sense. That would be maybe to make next sense for the next thing. So given all the things that have happened, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I got lots of thoughts on it.
Visit aroundtheempire.com to find the various ways that you can gain access to the bonus content, join the Discord community, and participate in the periodic Zoom calls where we talk among ourselves. I hope that some of you will join us, and now we'll continue with the wrap-up. I really appreciate this. I still have like about 50 more questions for you, but we should probably wrap this up. And I'd like to, if you could tell us what's the best way to follow your work, how to support your work, and keep up with the things that you're doing and the interviews that you're doing.
There's no good way to do that. I don't tweet. I don't do social media. I just do, I think I did 12 or 13 interviews last week. So I did 3 on Republic TV, the biggest TV station in India, which has 400,000 viewers, 400 million viewers. I did 3 on CGTN, Chinese TV. I did 3 on Russian TV. I don't know if they were able to use anything I said, because I'm honest with them. And I did Portugal. I did Voice of America in China. So I do them all over the world, very few in the United States. and I do Pacifica Radio and other things, but I don't know I don't know the easy way to. There's
Well, we'll
no easy
search for you.
answer.
We'll search for you. That's what we'll do.
A lot of these things are out there, the videos, and they're on YouTube, and they send them to me, and I don't. But people should all watch. Every time I show my students episodes of Untold History, they're flabbergasted. They think it's so powerful and amazing.
Me too. Yeah.
And that first question about Wall Street that I got today, watch episode 7 about the Vietnam War. It is so. I showed it to my students the other day, and they were so moved by it. But we deal with that question of how the U.S. runs the empire, and it's not by hoarding, marauding mobs of barbarians. Usually, it's by Ivy League educated people carrying briefcases. Who are. We live in a world in which the richest 8 people have more wealth than the poorest 4 billion people. We live in a country in which the richest 3 people have more wealth than the bottom half of the population. How do these things happen? So please, everybody, read Untold History and come with us on our next visit to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. People who are not American university students are invited, and there's a non-credit option that's less expensive. And we also bring students from the George School in Philadelphia, not far from where you are, Joanne. It's an amazing experience. We travel with Japanese students and professors. We also deal with Japanese atrocities toward other Asians in World War II, in addition to American atrocities. But it's just an amazing experience.
My partner would love that. Speaks Japanese, did a lot of business in Japan, loves Japan. I'll tell him about it.
Good.
And again, thank you so much. I'm going to get the update to the book. Good. And then I'll be begging you to come back on the podcast.
You don't have to beg. I'll be happy to do it.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Good to see you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Peter Kuznick. Find Peter Kuznick on the American University website. Look for the updated version of his book with Oliver Stone, The Untold History of the United States. That's a new 2019 edition. And watch their documentary series, which is available on multiple streaming services. This is a fully independent podcast. In this age of censorship, your support is more important than ever. Go to the website aroundtheempire.com to find the various ways you can get access to bonus content and support the show. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave reviews. Those things help. Follow on Twitter @AroundTheEmpire. Join us on Telegram, t.me/AroundTheEmpire. And we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody. Hang in there.